Okay, let's go ahead and get started. It's 1:01, and I just want to make sure I respect everybody's time. So we'll go ahead and get started, and I will let people in as they pop into the waiting room. So thank you all so much for being here with us today. My name is Vicky Layman. I am the Community Engagement Specialist at Child Care Answers. Child Care Answers is the local child care resource and referral agency, and we serve Hamilton, Hendricks, and Marion counties. We work with families who are looking for childcare, need additional connections to resources, one-on-one support. We work with individuals in the community to advocate and educate, and we work with childcare providers and programs that are looking to get connected to resources, starting their childcare business, and get connected to grants. That's us in a nutshell. I will also make sure that I put my contact info in the chat box. So if you have any other questions about Child Care Answers, or you want to know more about who we are and what we do, I can go ahead and connect with you via email. I would love to do that. So before we get started, I want to do just a few housekeeping things. So first, just to let you all know, we are recording. So we're recording this presentation today. We will be sharing the recording after the fact with all of the attendees and individuals that were registered. I do ask that you please stay muted. You entered the meeting muted and with your camera off. I just ask that you stay muted so that we don't have any feedback or anything like that. That would be super helpful for us. And you can go ahead, I will be monitoring the chat box for Lisa, so you can go ahead and put any questions you might have in the chat box. Lisa says she thinks there's going to be some time at the end for Q&A. At the end, I will also pop up just a really quick poll question, and then I will make sure that I also put an after workshop survey into the chat box. So that's kind of where we're headed today. I am so excited to welcome Lesa Paddack with InSource, who is going to be our content expert on all things Special Ed 101, parents' rights, roles, and responsibilities when it comes to the special needs process and the special education process in the school system, and working with their children and their school district to get the best possible scenario for their young ones. So I'm going to hand things over to Lesa. If you have any questions or anything like that, please put them in the chat box, and I will be monitoring that as we go. And Lesa, you let me know if you need anything in the meantime, but I will hand things over to you.
Thank you, Vicki. Thanks everyone for being here today. And I just want to welcome you, and we are going to cover just some basics of Special Ed 101. As always in this virtual setting, we do hope that technology works and works the right way. So please bear with me if we have any difficulties. So my name is Lesa Paddack, and I work for InSource, which is Indiana's Resource Center for Families with Special Needs. And I am the InSource Parent Liaison to the Indiana Department of Education. And I have been with InSource almost 16 years. So I am here today to talk about Special Ed 101, and I'm very excited because we want to partner with families, schools, community stakeholders, helping families understand their rights, roles, and responsibilities under the law. So first of all is a legal disclaimer. This information is provided for educational purposes and does not constitute legal advice. I am not an attorney, nor am I giving legal advice. And if you so need an attorney or have questions that you need answered, please make sure that you consult with a competent attorney prior to taking any legal action. So that is the disclaimer, and we will move right along. Okay, some information about InSource. I don't know how many of you all have used InSource or have heard of InSource. Maybe you know about us, maybe you don't. But InSource is the Parent Training and Information Center for Indiana, and we have been the Parent Training and Information Center since 1975. So we were one of the first original 5 parent training and information centers in the nation. When IDEA came about, one of the requirements had to do with the fact that each state had to have at least one parent information training center to help families understand their rights, and InSource has been that one for 45 years. Our current funding comes from the Indiana Department of Education and the U.S. Office of Special Education. We are part of a national network, and our services are free to parents. You might ask, what do we do and how do we help? And every parent information training center throughout the country is a little bit different. I like to think that we offer some additional robust services. We have regional offices throughout Indiana. So no matter where someone lives in Indiana, there is a regional staff that covers their area. You will be able to find that information on our website at InSource.org by going to the map and clicking on the county that the family or yourself needs service in. We provide individual phone assistance, and that is a large portion of what we do. We spend the day on the phone helping families understand the special ed process, speaking to schools, community stakeholders, but we do a lot of individual phone assistance in our day. We also offer parent training and community training classes just like this one. And we are also one of the few parent training and information centers in the country that still support at school meetings or IEP meetings. Those are very time intensive, and so many parent training and information centers have gone away from that. At this point, of course, because of COVID, we are attending all trainings and case conferences virtually. We hope at some point we can be back in the schools and back in the buildings providing that assistance in person. But at this point, everything that we're doing is the way it is today virtually. Please note, and I hope that you'll visit our website at InSource.org. We have a large variety of resources and publications, online training classes and archived webinars, and a calendar of our training events. We have added a plethora of information about COVID and special education. We have put together some additional webinars twice this last year. We have interviewed Dr. Holsapple, who's the Director of Special Education for Indiana, and we have been continually trying to provide additional resources to families from the Office of Civil Rights, the U.S. Department of Education, along with the Indiana Department of Education and other partners and communities throughout the state. Okay, so today we're going to cover several things. So the special education process, we very much feel that a family cannot make a decision if they are not informed. So our role with a family is not to make the decision for them. We do not know their child. We don't know the school situation. We are here to help them learn to advocate and to learn the process. We want to help them understand what to do if they disagree. We want them to understand what an IEP is. We want them to understand what the terminology is. So our role is helping them understand that special ed process and what their role is in that process. And lastly, we will cover how to resolve disputes. So there is a system set up to resolve disputes. There's a complaint process, there's mediation, there's facilitated IEP process, and there's a due process. So there are several different ways that a family and a school can try to work out difficulties, and we're going to discuss those. Okay, so what is special education? Years ago, special education was more of a place. Today, special education is a term that means meeting the unique needs of your child who has special needs so that they can benefit from their education. These services are provided by the public school at no cost, and they can be in a variety of different settings, okay? And it is very important to know that the shift has come about so that children can and should be educated in their less restrictive environment. And that is what we first will expect, is to educate that child in their least restrictive environment. And some of those environments do include classroom, home, hospital, or in some kind of institutional setting or residential setting. Okay. One of the first things to understand is the procedural safeguards, and parents are given a copy of these annually or at a time when their child perhaps is facing expulsion, when they're new to the system. And those procedural safeguards, we often kind of laugh and say, you know, in general, I've got a lot of these, I don't need any more. But we do encourage families to take those and to read through those. Everyone at InSource is a parent or has a sibling that has special needs. So we have been on both sides of that table. And it is very, very important to understand from the beginning what your rights are as that parent, and then moving along as that actual student. And InSource is listed on the back of those procedural safeguards, as are some other organizations that can help. But many times those procedural safeguards are kind of laughed about a little bit. I've got a lot of them. Oh, look, they're in this color this year, this color. But it is important for families to sit down and really read what it says so that they will know how to be truly a participant in their child's special education process, to know that they are supposed to receive prior notice and they're supposed to provide consent for certain things, and to know what the school can do without their consent because it's considered general education. That they are to know that personally identifiable information is important and protected, that they can examine relevant records, and that there is a way to have a timely and impartial resolution of disputes. And many times if a family does not sit down and go over these things, then the first time that they really look at it is when we've brought them back up to the family to help them know what their choices are. Okay, so we are going to talk a little bit about the special education process and the overview. So you will see each of these little bubbles, and each of these is an important part of the special education process. Okay, so the first bubble, you can see it's kind of highlighted in yellow, which I am not positive how well that shows for you, but it is the referral process. So it is important to know that many times in this area, maybe parents gotten a concern and they may go to a teacher, or perhaps a physician has brought about a concern and has mentioned to a parent, hey, I'm concerned about your child's speech or your child's behavior. So the very first step in special education is the referral. Okay, so the referral for evaluation is what we're going to discuss. Parents can make that request, and typically it is the parent. Sometimes it is a school, but many times it is a parent. So as I stated, school staff can make that request, and the parent would make that request. We encourage it to be in writing, not because it can't be verbal, but because putting it in writing gives you some time frame, and it's much easier to remember when you sent it. Public agency has 10 instructional days to give the parent written notice of what they're going to propose. So parent says, I'm concerned about my child's speech. I'm asking for an evaluation for speech. You put that in writing with your concerns. The school has 10 instructional days to answer back to say, yes, we're going to do an evaluation, or no, we're not, and the reasons why, because there must be reasons why if they're not going to. And the school does need consent from the parent in writing to evaluate a student. So sometimes when a parent contacts us, they feel that they have made a request, but when we get consent and talk to school, school doesn't realize that. So that is another reason why it is important to ensure that you make your request clear and plain to a certified staff that I have a concern, here is the concern, I am requesting an evaluation for speech services or for special education evaluation for emotional issues. It's really important to do that because sometimes there's confusion and everyone wants to cut down on the confusion. And we want to make sure that the time frame starts and everyone's clear about when that time frame started. So after an evaluation is made, the school has 50 instructional days to complete that after the consent. So The time frame starts. Obviously, that doesn't count for summer, that doesn't count for vacations, any of those type of things. But when the evaluation is done, the consent starts, then parent needs to understand that that starts the timeline, and that is why it is so important to know when the request was made, when the response was given, and when the consent was signed. Okay, so after the referral happens, then you will look at the evaluation. We will later on talk about the 13 areas of eligibility in Article 7. So we will take a look at that. But with the evaluation, there's a discussion about what, as a parent, do you want evaluated? Because the school psychologist and the school team have to know what the concern is. So it's also the same if the school brings about the concern, they're going to come back to the parent and they're going to say, we have a concern about your child's behavior. We have a concern about your child's academics. And the parent still would need to sign that consent in order to have that start. But the parent and the school would still need to sit down to decide what to evaluate, because the parent will sign a consent for the areas that everyone agrees to evaluate, because school can't evaluate other areas. They can come back and say, hey, we've got a concern about this area, but there needs to be consent to actually evaluate, okay? So the educational evaluation determines if the student is eligible for special education services, provides information to determine the needs of the student, and then following that evaluation, the case conference committee would meet to discuss eligibility and services. So that's a lot right there. So I'll break it down a little bit more. So school psychologist, school staff would talk with parent. Often it is the psychologist. What are your concerns? Talk with them a little about the different areas of concern, sign a consent, and then there will be certain portions of the evaluation where the parent is given some rating scales perhaps, or some information to fill out. They will also ask for information about a social history, about the child's birth, milestones, medical diagnoses, things that have occurred before. Were they in first steps or an early intervention program? So they will have like a social medical history along with particular things that are evaluated or particular assessments that are done based on the area of eligibility, so that this educational evaluation, we hope, looks at many areas of the child, because it is to be done with a multidisciplinary team. So not just one person. So different people doing different jobs, looking together at this child in order to complete this evaluation. Additionally, if this is a first evaluation, an initial evaluation, when the parent signs consent, they have that ability to state that they want to have the report 5 days ahead of time so that they can look over it. Perhaps their doctor can look over it. Maybe their InSource person, whoever it is, so that they are not sitting down at the table and reading it at the moment that everyone's discussing it, because often that really does put a parent at a disadvantage to not know what is in that report. Okay, and about 11:30-ish, we'll stop to see if there are questions along the way. The next area that we're going to discuss is eligibility. So with an IEP, a student not only has to have a disability, but the disability has to adversely affect education. So that can be academically or functionally, such as behavior, or both. But in order to receive an IEP, that is a requirement. It is not just a requirement to have a diagnosis. Matter of fact, a child can have an IEP and not have a medical diagnosis many times, but they must fall into an area of eligibility to be able to be served with an IEP. Okay, so the eligible child is defined as I stated, the disability interferes with the student's academic achievement, functional performance, or both. And that evaluation process is going to measure the amount of adverse effect. So some of the things that might occur have to do with behavior rating scales, maybe, that are given to teachers, given to parents. Sometimes depression scales are given to a variety of different people. The student themselves may even be given some rating scales. Their academics will be looked at, how they are doing on their state assessments, how they are doing with their daily life skills in the school setting will be looked at. And that will also include how they are interacting with their teachers and with their peers, how well they are doing socially, emotionally in that environment. Okay, so I mentioned before that there are 13 areas of eligibility. So obviously there are a few here that most certainly are going to need a medical diagnosis. Okay, and that would be like deaf, blind. Okay, and typically you would also have intellectual disability. You would often already have that medical diagnosis, but not always. So some of these other areas of eligibility, most kids will probably already have a medical diagnosis, but it's not required on some of these areas of eligibility. So keep in mind, the school does not give a medical diagnosis. What the school psychologist and the team does is they work to see, does this student, are they eligible for services under this area of eligibility? So schools will never give a diagnosis. Sometimes you hear a parent say, the school diagnosed my kid with autism. Well, no, the school stated that your child fell under the eligibility category of autism based on the assessments that were done. And Article 7 does talk about what has to be done. Observations, social, emotional, medical history, rating scales, a variety of different things, but schools themselves do not give medical diagnosis. Physicians, licensed clinicians in the medical field give medical diagnosis. So if a child comes in deaf or deaf-blind, then there will be some type of medical information as far as that. But for many of these others, sometimes the student has it, sometimes the student does not have it. But keep in mind, school does not give a medical diagnosis. Additionally, developmental delay. In Indiana, that age was extended a few years ago to the age of 9. It used to stop, I think at the age of 5 when a student went into kindergarten, but in Indiana, there was a push to extend that to the federal level. And it really has helped some kids who were really struggling, but would not have fit under any of the other areas of eligibility when they were 5. And this gave some more time for them to be ready for school, to learn, to get involved in that learning academics and social emotional, so that by the time they came closer to 9, if they were still having issues, then they would hopefully fall under one of these other 12 areas of eligibility. Okay, now we'll talk a little bit about the IEP. And the IEP is an individualized education plan. So that you know, we have something that's called A Parent's Guide to the IEP, and it was written by Dr. Angie McKinney and some of our staff. Dr. Angie McKinney works for the Indiana IEP Resource Center. And the Parent's Guide to an IEP is basically the Indiana IEP. And in each of the areas in the Indiana IEP, there is an area that's written about what should typically be discussed in that blank, so to speak. And it's really, really helpful. And it's a great tool to send out to families so that they can get an understanding of what should be discussed during their case conference. Okay, one question we get a lot is who should be attending the case conference? Okay, well, in order for a meeting to actually be a compliant case conference, you have to have more than just a parent and a special ed teacher. So here are some of the case conference committee members. And of course, we have the parent and the student, and then there also must be public agency rep. And that public agency rep is not only just a school employee. Article 7, which is the special ed law for Indiana, states that that public agency rep is supposed to be someone who can commit funds. And that is very important. Often there is a struggle to have a public agency rep at the meeting that can commit funds, but that is one of the requirements of a public agency rep. The teacher of record, which is a special education teacher or a speech language pathologist for a student receiving speech services. An instructional strategist, you will often find someone who is going to help with the specially designed instruction, because with an IEP, you're basically saying, what do we need to do here different from other students who don't have any kind of delay or a gap in their learning? So we're going to be writing goals to try to close that gap, and we need some specially designed instruction. What we're going to be doing differently for Johnny than Paul, because Paul doesn't have an IEP and Johnny does. What are we going to do to try to close the gap? A general education teacher and others with knowledge of the student's needs. And a parent can bring with them anyone they'd like to that has knowledge of the student. So here are some of the things that the IEP must contain. So when you look at the IEP, think of it as a contract and think of it as a document that is to be followed the way it's written. So part of why it's so important for a family to know their rights is so that they know what to do if they agree, they disagree. Do they agree what the proposed IEP says, what the services are, what the present levels are? And if a family doesn't know what their rights are, if they don't know the system, if they don't know what an IEP is, then they can't effectively advocate in the way that they need to. So an IEP must contain these things: the student's present level of performance, and you might see grades in there, you might see I-step grades, there could be scores, there could be a variety of different things, but basically that's going to tell you what the child is doing at this point. How the disability affects progress, because that's the reason the child has an IEP. Measurable goals for a student. So the goals should be measurable so that you know where the child is and where you would like the child to get in a year and how they're going to get there. And that is how the progress is also to be measured. A family would get a copy of the progress monitoring information every 9 weeks with the report card. And then you will also know how that progress is going to be measured depending on how this is all written. Are we going to do it in a narrative? Are we going to measure this every month? There's a variety of different components. It could be a graduated goal. So it can be written in a variety of different ways, but your goal should be measurable, and how the progress is to be measured should be known. And special education and related services. Does this child need speech? Do they need PT? Do they need special transportation? And what do they need for special education services? So how many minutes of support are they going to get? Where is it going to be given? So special education and related services are very important, because that is going to be a large portion of the way what that child's day is going to look like to try to work on those goals. Additionally, an IEP must contain these components. ESY, extended school year. So somewhere along that year, you're going to want to have that discussion, and it should be had every year. And there are certain conditions that you look at for extended school year. And the Department of Education just came up with an updated document on extended school year and the reasons to consider extended school year. The student's least restrictive environment. So as I mentioned before, under IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the very, very, very first place that all students should be looked at to be educated is the general education room with their peers. Then you would look at giving them assistance in the room. And then you would look at increasing that assistance before you would look at pulling them out of that room. Okay, and there are also federal Lre codes, and that tells you how many minutes in the day your student is in a general education room. The transfer to rights to a student who turns 18, because once a student turns 18, those rights turn to them, unless their parents have gotten guardianship or someone has, and written notes of the meeting. This is also really important. I get to see IEPs all across the state, and sometimes I get an IEP and there's no written notes. There should be written notes. A discussion, a capturing of what has gone on in that meeting should be included in those notes. So our next thing that we are going to look at has to do with placement, and that goes back to LRE. It goes back to the least restrictive environment, and where is the least restrictive environment for this child to be educated at where they can meet their goals. Okay. So the law states, to the maximum extent appropriate, students must be educated in the general ed setting. Now, that does not mean that all kids 100% should all be in the general education setting at all times and never pulled out. What that means is that that case conference committee needs to intentionally and meaningfully look at the different continuum of service placement for a child. So we always want to start looking at general ed, but for some children, their least restrictive environment is not going to be general ed. It might be a resource room or even a special classroom. But on the flip side, we always want to work to make sure that students are exposed to general education for the maximum amount that they can. So even if a student is in a special education classroom, I ask the question, why are they in there all the time? What academic classes can they have in general education? How are they part of their general education classroom? What are they doing with their non-disabled peers? It needs to be meaningful. Even if that student perhaps is not able to be in general ed at all times, we have to ask those difficult questions so that we ensure that child has every opportunity to be involved and part of that general ed curriculum and exposure as much as possible. Modifications can be made in the general ed setting. That is often a difficult discussion. Modifications can be made in general ed setting, but when you get to high school, that does change. So I won't really touch on that, but just keep in mind in high school, you have to, you can accommodate but not modify the work in order to be getting a diploma. But in the lower grades, you can modify work in that general ed setting. Now, keep in mind, anytime a child is not in general ed working on grade level material, they are missing out some time. Okay, and eventually there will have to be a meaningful discussion about where is this student functioning by nature of their disability. Are they going to be able to get an Indiana diploma? But that is not a decision that needs to be made in second grade and third grade and fourth grade. Know that in that elementary school and that middle school, modifications can be made in that general ed setting. Special classes, separate schooling or placement other than general ed occurs if these components, the education with the same age peers can't achieve. This student can't achieve based on the nature and severity of the disability, and the case conference committee determines that that student needs that setting outside of general ed. And sometimes this is one of the hard discussions that occurs. And that is part of why we always first think about, can we meet this child's needs in general education with assistance if they need that? because that is the place we start. That is a right of a child to be educated with their peers. And then, okay, this child cannot reach their goals in that setting all day. Then we start looking at how many minutes, what do we need in a different setting in order to be able to reach their goals. And that leads into a continuum of service. So schools are required to ensure availability of continuum of placement options. Now, keep in mind, I am talking about public schools. I am not talking about private schools, okay? Public schools, charter schools are public schools, just FYI, in case somebody wonders. So public schools are required to ensure availability of continuum of placement options, and that does include charter schools. And here are your continuum of service locations. A student can be educated in any of these, but obviously as you go down this list, it becomes more restrictive and not less restrictive. Okay, next we will talk about instruction. Vicki, are there any questions yet?
Yeah, we have 2 questions. So the first question is, when it comes to requesting the evaluation and giving consent, can they request the evaluation and give consent at the same time on the same paper, or is it separate paperwork that must be done?
Well, in a perfect world, I would suppose a parent could do that, but they're still going to have to sign the particular consent form. So let's say they go into the school and they talk to the principal and they're very concerned, and right away principal says, yes, we're concerned, here's your consent. We got the psychologist here and we will go ahead and you can sign consent. But typically what happens is that request will often go to a multidisciplinary team at the school. They'll talk to the general ed teacher, several teachers. They will look at some of the information going on, and then the school will respond back and give an answer. But in theory, a parent could go in, they could have a meeting that day, and they could sign the consent that day. It just often doesn't go quite that smoothly, but it could. So a family could go in, make a consent. If they've got the necessary people and the school says yes, they could sign that consent. But you wouldn't necessarily want to assume, if you write an email and say, I want my son Johnny evaluated for learning disability and I give my consent, there are forms that have to be signed.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And then the next question is the process, so the process is all the same for 504s as well?
Not exactly. So when you think about a 504, so a 504 is an anti-discriminatory plan. So if your child has an IEP, they would in theory be also covered for service for a 504, but it doesn't go the other way around. So with a 504, a child has to have just has a disability or is known to have a disability that impacts a major life area. So you can see that as much broader than where a disability negatively impacts education or function. So when you look at a 504 plan, many times a school now will do, because they have to do an evaluation for 504, some of them will do a very similar evaluation as they would for special ed, okay? And then if the student is found not eligible for special ed, then they move right into a 504. But keep in mind, those are 2 different things. And by the way, you do not need to have them at the same time. Sometimes a student will get a 504 while they're waiting to finish the evaluation for the IEP, because there does have to be an evaluation process for a 504, but some schools have come up with an evaluation process that they feel meets their needs, has the medical information, and then they start their next evaluation for special ed, because there is a significant difference in those 2 documents. So an IEP is governed under IDEA and Article 7, and a family files a complaint to the Department of Education. If a 504 is not followed, then that goes to the Office of Civil Rights. So two different agencies overseeing, and if 504 does not have goals and the school does not receive does not receive funding for 504 at all, whereas with an IEP, they do receive funding for an IEP. So there is an evaluation process for the 504, but it is much easier to qualify for a 504 than it is to qualify for an IEP.
Thank you, Lesa.
Okay. All right. So next, we're going to talk about his instruction. So how does this child learn? How do we work on closing those gaps? Okay. So we're going to also look at the review. So when we write an IEP, we write that IEP typically for a year. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to wait a year to have another case conference. If you have concerns, you can call a case conference at any time. If a family feels their child is not progressing on their goals, if something new has happened, if there are new issues, you can call a case conference. Maybe a child has already met their goals partway through the year. Well, you would want to look at calling a case conference to look at some new goals. So know that an IEP is written for a year, but it does not mean that you have to wait a year in order to have a case conference. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the instruction and the ACR, that annual case review. So when you look at the IEP, and there's different components all the way through this, starting from your demographic information and strengths of the child, concerns of a parent, concerns of the school, present levels, goals. It moves all the way through, including transportation. So in there, there's going to be discussion about the goals, about specially designed instruction, how is the instruction going to be delivered, and where is the instruction going to be delivered? Is the instruction going to be delivered in the general education classroom, in the resource room, in a whole separate classroom? How will that occur? So you can even have that case conference, make a decision that this is what we're going to do, and then maybe it doesn't work. Okay. And if it doesn't work, you can come back together and say, I don't think it's working in the environment that we have, or with the goals, or even with the minutes of service and the special ed support. I think my child, is not progressing and they need more than 15 minutes of speech, or perhaps they need X, Y, and Z. So keep in mind that the IEP is a contract, but it also can be fluid. You can get back together again. You can restructure this and change things about it, but there is a process to do it in order for it to be legal. So as we look at the IEP as a contract with lots of different components, it is important for parents to know that they have a voice and they have rights, and that there's a process to agreement, disagreement, to meetings, to services. And so one thing to keep in mind is the difference in an initial IEP and a revised IEP. So with an initial IEP, that is the first IEP, and a parent must provide written consent before services can start. So if a parent has a concern, or a school does, there's an evaluation. School has a meeting, just like always, to say, we're going to go over the evaluation, and we're going to say whether we think your child is eligible or ineligible for special ed services. So the school proposes, yes, your child is eligible under one of those 13 areas of eligibility. This is the IEP we propose. You have a discussion about it. You have a discussion about services, about goals. It is still up to the parent to provide written consent before it can start. So a parent who is coming into this process reads the evaluation, has a meeting about everything, the school and you work together at that meeting and they propose it, it still will not go into effect until written consent. Okay, and if they don't consent, then it's not going to go into effect. Okay. Another important part to understand in the process is many times parents will call and say, well, I said I didn't like it. That's not enough. Anytime if a parent is truly in disagreement, they have to move forward. And that disagreement means I disagree and I'm asking for another meeting or a mediation or facilitated IEP or even due process, which you would hope you wouldn't have to get to. So it isn't just saying, I don't like this. Okay. A parent has to move along to the next action. But keep in mind for that initial IEP, a parent has to sign that. So you have to come to some kind of agreement to get that signed IEP. Or if they're in disagreement, that's when they're saying, I'm challenging this and I want to go perhaps to mediation over eligibility. Okay. Now compare that to a revised IEP because those guidelines are different. So when a parent meets for that case conference, the school has 10 instructional days to get you a copy of that IEP in both cases. And with a revised IEP, that parent has 10 instructional days to propose, to respond to the proposed IEP by agreeing to it or challenging the revision. Okay. And challenging means we want to have another meeting, or I'm asking for an FIEP, a facilitated IEP, or mediation. It doesn't mean I don't dislike this. Okay. There has to be an action that moves you forward. Okay. And the hope is that the parent challenges the revised IEP, the parent school will work through the differences. But if they continue to move forward in disagreement, the school can implement that IEP on the 11th instructional day after the meeting, unless the parent takes them to due process over it. So not very long ago, about 2 years ago, there was a change in Article 7. Of course, the hope is with school and families, everybody's going to sit down and have more meetings. But at some point, it is the school's responsibility to educate a child, and they are going to come back with a proposed IEP. Okay, so in general, remember on the 11th day, that IEP is going to go into effect. If you disagree, you need to have an action and say you want to have something else. But there is a certain point in time where after there's been meetings, the school can say, we've got to implement this in order to teach your child. If we can't come to any more agreement, then you would have to go to due process over that. And we'll talk a little bit about due process and those things. That is a legal proceeding, and we hope to be able to stay away from that in general by coming to the table and really hashing out with some good communication, what does everybody think this child needs? Okay. Very quickly, I want to mention something else. So there is something called a written opinion, and any case conference member can submit this written opinion about the proposed IEP within 10 business days. So a written opinion is another way to provide a documentation of issues and concerns for further reference. So perhaps a parent and a school can't come to agreement about eligibility, but parent is not going to contest, or even school, they're not going to move to mediation, but someone wants to put in a written opinion saying that though this child is being served under this eligibility, this case conference committee member feels they should be served under another eligibility, or should receive additional minutes for something, or served in a different LRE. So it does not stop the implementation of the IEP. It is simply a written opinion that shares someone's concern about gaps, omissions, suggestions for improvement. So keep in mind, any case conference committee member can submit a written opinion. Okay, it goes into the student's file. But if a parent does that, that does not mean that they are contesting the IEP. It does mean they're submitting a written opinion about something they want documented. Okay, we are at the point to resolve disputes. Many times with families and schools, things get emotional. And part of what we do at InSource is we are there to help with some of the tough discussions. We aren't there to make decisions. We are there to discuss what Article 7 says, to bring it to light, put it on the table, have the parent read it, have the school read it, and sometimes have some tough discussions. Good communication is the best way to avoid disagreements. Part of what we tell both school and family is to think carefully about putting your concerns in a good forum. I am concerned about this based on A, B, and C. This is what I would like to do about it, A, B, and C. Because many times when we get involved, sometimes both sides are saying similar things, but communication has just broke down and there's not trust at that point. So keeping those avenues of communication and being direct about them is really important. Students have better outcomes, of course, when parents and schools work together, which is part of what we say. We are going to leave and the school and the parent are still there. So it is important for both sides to listen, because no one knows a child better than a parent, but sometimes schools see something different in an educational environment than a parent sees. So good communication, being upfront with concerns, and going to the right person with those concerns. So it is very important for a family to know the hierarchy. If I've got a concern, I should go to the general ed teacher, or I should go to the special ed teacher, I should go to the principal, then I should go to my special ed director. And many times families don't even know that there is a special ed director. So it's very important to know the hierarchy and who to go to about your concerns, to be able to work out the differences as quickly and as easily as possible. But the law does provide for formal dispute resolution. So we're going to talk about that. Okay. A family who chooses can file a formal complaint with the Indiana Department of Education if the school is not implementing or following the IEP. So one of the very first things that we talk to a family about is get out your IEP. Sometimes they send them to us. We look at them because many times there is something that they feel is not being followed. But a lot of times when we look at it, it's actually not written in the IEP. So we explain to parents and guardians, it's really important to read over the IEP after the meeting, or we encourage schools to project the IEP during the meeting so that everybody can kind of tweak it and look at it and discuss how things are worded. Because if you're going to file a formal complaint about the school not following the IEP, then those components have to be in the IEP. And I would say a large percentage of the time when perhaps someone calls us and they say, my kid is supposed to be getting these accommodations or these amount of minutes, when we get the IEP and we walk through, it's not necessarily written there. Maybe it was before, but it's not at this point. And so then we have to have that discussion. So think of a complaint as a procedural violation, okay? And so those procedural violations follow the requirements of Indiana special education law. So keep in mind that not all states have a special education law. And a special education law that's written by the state can do more, but not less than IDEA. So they can't decide to change those services unless they're giving more services. But keep in mind that a complaint is a procedural violation. My child was supposed to be transported on a particular bus that meets his need. My child's supposed to get speech and they are not. My child is to get these accommodations or these minutes of service. It is a procedural violation, okay? So there are some choices when you look at resolving disagreements between parents and schools, and I've mentioned these several times. So a parent can ask to meet with a staff and reconvene a case conference. we have a concern. I don't think this is occurring. We need to set a time to reconvene a case conference. And that needs to be done mutually agreeable time. Okay. I usually encourage families to put that out there, include all the people that you want to be there. Think about, are there strategic people that you need there for that whole conference? Keep in mind what you think is a reasonable amount of time to solve this and let the school know it. Perhaps, you know, this is something kind of involved and you say, I think this is going to take an hour of our time to discuss this, and I need the math teacher who we're having some issue with to be there. Now, keep in mind when it comes to non-certified staff, like aides or some of the non-certified staff, it's up to the school to make a decision whether they get to attend that conference or if all the information goes through that teacher of record. So be upfront, say there's a problem, meet with a public agency representative, or also ask for a facilitated IEP meeting. So Indiana IEP Resource Center holds something called facilitated IEP meetings, and you can find out more about it on their website. But basically, one of their staff come in and they run the meeting. So it is voluntary, and their staff runs the meeting, and it helps in situations where people feel like they have not gotten their voice heard. Communication's broken down, perhaps trust is broken down. So a facilitated IEP meeting really is a good choice to have. Of course, someone can ask our staff additionally to attend, or other organizations, or maybe a family friend or family member to attend. But these are some of the things you want to look at when you've got a concern or you're contesting. What, you know, you want to come up with an action plan and say, this is what I need. I need to have another case conference to discuss these issues because of this. Additionally, a parent can ask for mediation. Mediation is also voluntary. Both sides have to agree. And as you can guess, with the term mediation, it is where the state gives a free mediator. That mediator is not there to make a decision. That mediator is there to mediate and try to get discussion going to come to an agreement. So in mediation, things are confidential. You could come up with a full agreement, a partial agreement, no agreement. And many times people are mediating over a complaint. So there is a complaint that has been filed with the Department of Education. And there is actually, when you look at a complaint that is filed through the iChamp system most of the time on the Department of Ed's website, there is even a process for a complaint and how the Department of Education walks through that process, how many days it is. And sometimes a family and a school will mediate over the complaint. Okay, so the complaint will be put on hold while they try to mediate and meet. Okay, but keep in mind, it is really important to know that each of these processes are important to understand each of the steps so that you can understand which one do I choose? Why do I choose it? What's the time frame on it? It is important to be educated about them, and on DOE's website and on ours and a variety of others, you can find all those different steps in dispute resolution. And of course, a parent may request additionally a due process hearing. So a due process hearing is exactly what you think. It is a legal proceeding. School will have attorneys. Families can have attorneys. They do not have to have an attorney. And it is a legal proceeding, a suit. There will be evidence introduced by both sides. There will be witnesses. It is very formal compared to mediation or a facilitated IEP meeting. And at the end of that due process hearing, then that due process hearing officer will make the decision themselves. Okay, so control is taken out of the hands of parent and school and placed in that due process officer's venue. They will make that decision. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about the parent responsibilities. And so parents are to not just have a seat at the table, but a voice at the table. IDEA is very plain about that they are as much a part of the case conference committee as anyone else, that they have a right to participate, to give or withhold written consent, to attend that case conference, and to serve as a student's advocate. One thing I would also explain has to do with working, as I said before, to have a good case conference, communicating what your concern is. If you need documents or you need information, asking for that ahead of time. Knowing what the school's concerns are. Many times what our InSource staff do, we have to get a consent for the family, but then we call the school to find out what their concerns are, because it really does help us discuss the situation with the parent and with the school. So we discuss the parents' concerns with the school. We discuss the school's concerns with the parents and the student, and it helps us approach that meeting objectively to be able to have some of those discussions. You will want to let them know who you feel like you need at that case conference, okay? And keeping in mind, okay, do I need all the teachers there for that whole time? Or do I just need this teacher, that public agency rep, and we need to be able to have enough time to discuss X, Y, and Z. Additionally, keep in mind that it should be a mutually agreeable time, and to work together with that. If the school does continue to offer different times over and over, they are allowed to have a case conference without a family present. And typically that's not something that anyone wants to have happen. So we always talk about, take a look at your calendars, take a look at how long this might take, make sure you have the necessary people, make sure people know as far ahead of time, and get as much of the required documentation to each other during that time, so they have an opportunity to look at everything, so you're ready for the meeting to be able to make some decisions. Okay, many times families will ask us some things to put in their home file, and these are just some examples of things. Okay, it's helpful to keep these things in your file so that you know where they are. You know, of course, you're getting report cards, you're getting progress monitoring information each 9 weeks. It's important to make sure that if you feel that, hey, my kiddo can't seem to do this, what they're doing at school at home, that you take samples of the homework and say, this is how far we're able to go before he or she has a meltdown. And I'm going to bring this information to you, and we're going to discuss how far at the case conference, how many hours do we work after school before we draw a line, you know, in the sand and say we're done. List of medications. You always want to keep the school up to date on the medications, because in an emergency, they need to know what your child is taking. So these are just some examples of things that you might want to have for yourself, so that you're able to pull the information together and be able to produce any information and keep a record of the information the school's giving you. In summary, special education, of course, as I said, follows a process. And that's one of the things I've hit on really hard today, because I want everyone to know there's a process. I want them to know they can disagree. I want them to know what it looks like when you walk through that process, how to be a partner in that process, because to be honest, many times it's very intimidating. A family will come in, and it may be just the family or one parent or the other or guardian, and the school has a variety of different people with letters after their names, and you don't know what they do for your child. So parents are equal partners in this process, but many times it's easy to feel intimidated, to not know what to discuss. And that's why InSource is here to try to help you. That's why the local InSource people are here to try to help you. That's why I am here to try to help you. I think Vicky is also going to drop my information in the chat box so that you can email me. But please note that you can contact any of the local Marion County folks or across the state by going to our website of InSource.org and looking at the county. We want to help families keep good records and participate fully and to try to solve their problems at the lowest level without hopefully going to due process. Now, obviously, sometimes due process has to happen, but it is better for all parties if by chance that agreement can be reached before that, and utilize a formal dispute resolution when needed. So one thing that I did want to mention when we talk about the formal dispute process, we talked about complaint, mediation, due process. When a family calls us, because we get lots of calls about complaints. So a complaint, again, is a procedural violation. My child could not access FAPE because the IEP wasn't being followed. Speech didn't occur, services didn't occur. When a family files that complaint, there is 10 days for the school and the family to try to fix that. Otherwise, that report starts. And then the Department of Education complaint investigators will basically ask for information from family, ask for information from school, and then they will, within the next, I think it is like 30 days, they will make sure that they get a report out, and it will deal with each of the areas and see whether there's a finding against the school or not. But keep in mind, it is procedural, okay? So I did want to very quickly mention our Parent Support Volunteer Program. We do utilize volunteers. We have obviously, we have our paid staff, and they cover different counties in the state of Indiana, but we use volunteers also. And we have a volunteer program where volunteers learn about special education, learn about communication, and they can help parents with special education issues. They assist our staff with workshops and fairs, and sometimes they even attend case conferences after it is deemed that they're able to do that. But there's a variety of different ways that that individuals could be a volunteer for us. So some of the things that we do in order to help those volunteers gain expertise are listed here. We do have those ongoing trainings, newsletters, professional development, social events, and opportunities to meet each other. And our volunteers are a vital part. They are in the community. And then, as I stated, people can make a decision of what they want to do. Maybe they want to help set up with a fair. Of course, right now we're only doing fairs virtually, but that, you know, we still need and can use volunteers that understand that we are here to objectively assist and help families understand that process. But we're not here doing the same work as a paid advocate. We are here to help families understand what their rights, rules, and responsibilities are so they can make informed decisions. So if you want to find out more about our volunteer program, please visit our website. Here's contact information. We are on Twitter, we are on Facebook, and also, as I stated, on our website, we have lots of webinars and trainings. We have printable resources like a worksheet of concerns, that parent's guide to the IEP, and we have a variety of different information about special education and COVID during this time. So my email address for anyone who would like it is Paddack, Paddack, at DOE.in.gov. I do work for InSource, but I have a DOE email address because I am actually embedded in the Department of Education on the special ed team. Any of our staff, including myself, will be happy to help you in any way that we can. And I do hope that you'll follow us on Twitter, find us on Facebook, go to our website, take advantage of the material and the printed information and webinars that we have. Also note that our website is now accessible in over 100 languages, and that is really exciting. And we also have bilingual staff. And we even have training programs for school translators where we assist with helping them learn those special education terms. So thank you all very, very much. Vicky, I think that's everything that I have, and I appreciate the opportunity to get to talk.
Thank you so much, Lesa. Does anybody have any questions? Are there any questions for Lesa? Feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask in that way, or you can also include things in the chat box. That is fine as well. So if there are any questions, I did put Lesa's contact information in the chat box. So you will have her info if you need it and you would like to reach out to her. While you guys are thinking through any questions you might have, I am going to pull up a poll really quickly. It really is just a super quick 3 questions, just really talking to you and asking you about the, how, if you will attend further webinars through us, how you prefer to receive your information. So if you would please, please, please give us your opinion in that poll and give us that information, that would be great. And then I am also going to put the link to our survey in the chat box. So I just dropped that link to our survey in the chat box. If you would be willing to click on that link and just pop in and fill out the survey really quickly, it should be really, really quick for you. And it really helps give us additional information about how we're doing, what information you might want, and different things like that so that we can plan better for our future webinars. Again, if there are any questions for Lesa or anything, any other questions that you might have, please drop them in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. Thank you to those of you that are responding to the poll. I really, really appreciate that. That's super helpful for us. If we don't have any questions for Lesa, I guess I will say thank you so much to those of you that attended today. I am going to stay on. I see that 8 of 12 of you have voted in our poll. And so I will leave that up and I'll stay on for a little bit here just in case you want to finish that off. But Lesa, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you. This has been fantastic. And we are so lucky that you were willing to join us today and share all of this information with everybody that was able to attend and the individuals who will end up watching the recording afterwards.
Well, thank you, Vicky, and thank you everyone for attending. I am happy to help in any way that I can, and you all have an excellent day.
Thank you, you as well.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close out the meeting. Thank you all so much for joining us today.